Our gun crews, pumped full of adrenaline by fear and excitement, hurled shell after shell at the French. When it was over, we were almost in a daze, from exhaustion, from excitement, and from the sudden silence following the incredible roar of combat. We actually felt lightheaded. I began to check with the batteries to determine casualties and found everyone extremely excited. We had taken casualties, however, and Hauptmann Wagner, battery commander of the 3rd Battery, had been seriously wounded by shrapnel. He was treated by medics at a field station and then sent to the rear for hospitalization. As soon as his physical condition permitted, he would be returned to a hospital near his home in Germany. Wagner's battery officer, Oberleutnant Karl Schumann, moved up to become 3rd Battery's new battery commander. When Wagner was hit, I began finally to be seriously aware of my own mortality. It was clear that it could just as easily have been me, or any of us, and that in fact any of us could be next. It was difficult for me to realize that I was not immortal. It began to rain heavily that evening, and the soldiers in foxholes abandoned them and put up their tents. I was very glad to be inside a dry house where I could listen to the patter of the rain on the roof and not be out in it. Our motorized artillery kept up harassing fire on the French all during the night. The next day was quiet, except for our nuisance artillery fire directed at crossroads and any other known strategic targets behind enemy lines, and the French nuisance artillery fire attempting to do the same to us. On May 28th, the French hit us again, this time not just artillery but with bombers, fighter planes and armoured vehicles as well. The artillery opened up on us first, and we immediately began to respond. The crashing of shells and the constant roar of combat began again, and the adrenaline flowed again. Suddenly we became aware that the explosions occurring around us, sending dirt and debris high into the air, were considerably more than the French artillery could be firing, and we realized that a few French airplanes were bombing us. As we continued our artillery barrage, the French bombers were followed by a dozen or more fighters making strafing runs on us. The sounds of the airplanes just added to the roar and confusion of battle. About 20 armoured vehicles tried attacking us next, but they were no match for our artillery and quickly scurried back toward Proyart. We determined after the action that our battalion had fired 361 rounds to help stop the attack. We took heavy nuisance artillery fire during the night, and we answered with 3 salvos of our own every hour. We were becoming so accustomed to the sound of artillery that the lack of it would have seemed abnormal. How quickly the definition of normal can change in just a few short days. I was finding combat to be both exhilarating and frightening. It was exhilarating because while the noise and action were going on, we lived in a high state of excitement. It was frightening because at any moment an exploding shell could blast us into eternity. No one could know 1 minute whether he would be alive the next. Since the French tanks had gone to the English Channel just as ours had, the only combat occurring was artillery exchanges, only occasionally accompanied by airplanes and armoured vehicles, and infantry patrols sent out to probe the 4 or 5 kilometres of level ground between the river and the hills. The purpose of the patrols was to find out what was there, to try to take prisoners, and to clean out the area so the French could not see us building pontoon bridges across the river and try to disrupt the work of the engineers. The patrols would vary in size from 5 or 6 men to a whole company of 180 men, depending on the purpose of the patrol. From captured prisoners, the division determined that opposite us were the 4th French Colonial Division with Senegalese infantry regiments and the 7th French North African Division with the 10th Moroccan Regiment and the 31st Algerian Regiment. My job was to be in contact with all the batteries, to handle logistics for the battalion, and to be ready to issue orders to the batteries to move up if the infantry should break through. If our infantry broke through, the artillery would have to move out also to prevent the infantry from moving out of our range, so we would not be able to support them. We could not move all 3 batteries at once, however, because artillery had to be available at all times to offer assistance if the enemy should counterattack our infantry. The batteries would move out one at a time, and the battalion staff would go with the first battery so they could determine where the other 2 batteries should go into position. Meanwhile, we continued to duel with the French artillery. We would select strategic targets to disturb the enemy, to give him no rest, to disrupt road crossings or bridges or communications. We would sometimes fire 100 to 150 rounds along a 2-kilometre stretch. We would often fire at the French rear echelon just to keep the personnel there off balance. Mostly such fire was for nuisance value, but occasionally it could do real harm to the enemy. Altogether, we were at the Somme River 9 days before launching our attack against the fortified French positions. When the operation at Dunkirk ended with the evacuation of much of the British Army to England and our tanks were free for further action, we prepared an attack to break through the French defences and proceed south toward Paris. The night of June 4th was filled with tension. The men were obviously restless. Major Ruck came to the makeshift desk where I was working in my office and sat down. He lit a cigarette and smoked in slow, deliberate puffs, inhaling deeply and exhaling slowly. "Working late, Knapper?" he asked finally. "Catching up on my paperwork," I said. "The French are burrowed in like moles," Rake said, speaking what was really on his mind. "And they obviously have no shortage of artillery. This will not be an easy assault. My hunch is that they know tomorrow is the date for our attack." "We should be able to help the infantry a great deal," I suggested. "We know exactly where they are, and we are zeroed in on them." I felt confident that our assault would be successful. "Proyart is well protected by those hills in front of it," Ruck countered. "The French will be firing down on our infantry from those heights, and their Moroccan and Senegalese soldiers are fierce fighters. We would make a bad mistake to underestimate them." He stood and snuffed out his cigarette. "Good night, Knapper," he said. "It is going to be a short night and a very long day tomorrow." With that, he left. It was disturbing to see Ruck worried. He was normally unflappable. The village of Proyart was the infantry's goal for the first day. We opened our artillery barrage on the French defensive lines at 5 a.m. We knew the exact distances and the sight corrections to make to hit almost any target. We knew where the roads were in back of their lines, and we knew where all the crossroads and sensitive places were. When our infantry attacked, we shifted our fire to the enemy artillery and mortar positions. We knew where those positions were from our own observations and from aircraft observations. Major Raka determined the targets for each battery and the number of rounds to be fired at each target. The Luftwaffe also bombed the French positions. Our infantry took the hills before Proyart, but then they were stopped by heavy French artillery fire and were unable to take the village. When they were unable to achieve their objective the first day, they dug in. They had to try again, of course, but they were exhausted and decided to try again the next day. We had to know where they were dug in so we would not fire on them. We continued with heavy fire during the day and on through the night. In the evening, as I prepared the report of the day's activity for Ruck's signature, Hauptmann Wimmer suddenly appeared in my office. It was immediately evident from the look on his face that something was terribly wrong. "Herr Hauptmann, what is it?" "Rehberg," he said. "He is dead. I thought you would want to know, since he was your friend." I heard the words, but their meaning did not sink in immediately. "What do you mean?" I asked stupidly. "Hill 84, west of Proyart," he added, as if filling out a statistical report. "A sniper got him. The Senegalese like to hide in the trees and shoot down on us. One of them killed him." It was beginning to register, and I felt oddly as if I were in a daze. I felt myself grow cold in spite of the early summer warmth. Wimmer stood in an awkward position, looking at me with a pained expression. "After more than 20 years, I had really forgotten what it was like," he said. Then, suddenly, he turned and disappeared as quickly as he had appeared. I finished the report, although my mind was hardly on it. Then I went out in the evening air to try to calm the turmoil in my mind. The flashes of the artillery, and the crashes that followed a split second later as our batteries continued firing during the night seemed to punctuate Rehberg's death. People get killed in war, I told myself. It had to happen sometime that I would lose a close friend in combat. I decided to talk to Ruck about it. Maybe he had experienced it before and could help me adapt. I went back inside and into Rake's office. "What is wrong, Knapper?" he asked when he looked at me. "Lieutenant Rehberg is dead," I said simply. Rake stared at me for a moment. "I think you need a drink," he said finally, reaching into a drawer. He poured me a cognac and I took a sip. The strong liquor had a surprisingly calming effect on my nerves. Rake lit a cigarette and took a long drag. "The price of war is very high," he said as he stood and walked to the window, staring out into the darkness. "Germany cannot regain the position it should have in Europe without war, because our enemies in the West will not permit it, and we cannot fight without suffering casualties and fatalities." He turned away from the window and faced me. "Lieutenant Rehberg's life is one price we have to pay to restore Germany to its rightful position in Europe." "Of course," I said. For a brief second, Herr Hofer passed through my mind's eye. He, in a way, had predicted Rehberg's death. "We will all lose close friends before this is over, Knapper. Probably the most effective solution is not to make friends, but that is not practical. We are going to need all the friends we can get to endure what is ahead of us. We cannot stop with France. We will have to deal with England as well. We just have to learn to take the loss of our friends like men." "Yes, you are right," I said, finishing my drink. "Thank you, Herr Mayer." I shed tears for a friend in the still darkness of that night. Death had hovered nearby for some time, but this was the first time it had touched me so closely. Hauptmann Wagner had been badly wounded, but he had gone home alive to convalesce. Rehberg would not go home. Ever. He had vanished from the face of the earth. He had been a friend, and his death brought the utter destructiveness of war home to me as nothing else could have. This was not a game, as manoeuvres had always been. Combat meant having the lives of those you cared for snuffed out in an instant. Rehberg's body was brought back during the night, under the cover of darkness. We buried him at 7 o'clock the next morning, in a cemetery from the World War. I attended his funeral, along with Wimmer and 15 of the men from the battery. His body was not mutilated. Although he was only 22 years old, he looked even younger in death, as if he should be at home, in the first flush of young adulthood, instead of lying there as a cold and cadaverous victim of war. My own mortality became a part of my mindset from that moment on. Seeing the dead Moroccan soldiers had been a terrible experience, but they had been the enemy. When the body lying before you is someone you have known and worked with, someone you liked and admired, someone whose life was just beginning. Army life could never again be the carefree existence it had been during my garrison duty at Plauen. But we had to learn to accept facts and try to go on with our duties. One thing that made it just a little easier was that we buried Rehberg and several infantrymen who had been killed at the same time in a cemetery from the last war, and the relative numbers of graves demonstrated that the World War had been much worse. We could see that hundreds of World War dead had been buried in the cemetery, and we were burying just a few. Our method of warfare obviously caused fewer casualties. Still, that knowledge offered little comfort. Rehberg was replaced by Lieutenant Jaschke, a small man with thinning blonde hair, blue eyes, and a fair complexion. He proved to be competent and capable. At 5:30 the next morning, we opened up with 15 minutes of concentrated annihilation fire on Proyart. Then we lifted our fire and the infantry attacked again. Our forward observation officers tried to watch where our infantry was and where the enemy was, and direct our fire on the French lines. We also continued our nuisance rounds on the enemy's rear echelon, on bridges, on crossroads, and on anything of strategic value to the enemy. But our priority was always to support the infantry. In moving our batteries across the Somme River, We discovered while investigating potential gun positions that the French had mined the roads, so we stayed off them. Before we could set up all of our guns on the other side of the river, we learned from our forward observers that Proyart had fallen to us, so we just kept going. We turned south toward Paris and resumed our marching formation. Our infantry took 314 Moroccan prisoners at Proyart, whom we passed as we moved forward. During the 9 days we had spent at the Somme River, the French had prepared bridges to be blown up on all the roads to Paris, and now they blew them up as they retreated. On June 8th, at the Havre River, the enemy took advantage of the natural defensive position on the far side of the river to turn and make another stand. This time our entire artillery regiment went into position, all 36 105mm cannons and 12 heavy 150mm howitzers, and laid down a withering barrage of artillery fire on the French position on the opposite side of the river. The enemy withdrew, and we crossed the river on pontoon bridges. At Sassy-le-Grand, we went into position at the Oise River. The French had once more turned to fight at the natural defensive position provided by a river with all its bridges blown. Here we could set up some of our guns close to the river and fire point-blank into the enemy machine gun nests across the river. Our infantry then sent a patrol across, followed soon by the rest of the infantry, which deployed on the opposite bank. By 9 p.m, our engineers had finished a pontoon bridge, and we sent one artillery battery across the river. During the night, our division intercepted a message from the French Fourth Army headquarters, instructing their troops to disengage. We held our fire and let them withdraw in order to keep our casualties to a minimum, although the French kept up some rifle and machine gun fire to make us think they were all still there. When we sent our remaining artillery batteries across the pontoon bridge, one of the pontoons sank, and we were held up for 4 hours while the engineers were called back to repair the bridge. Then we finally crossed in full force and resumed our march toward Paris, although the French felled a lot of trees across the roads to impede our march. Our infantry lost 12 men during the fight at the Oise River. We went into position again at Verneuil and Fleurines. On the evening of June 11, 1940, the French attacked us at Senlis at 10:00 p.m. The attack continued through the night and the next day. The constant roar of combat, a sound that incorporated the explosion of artillery and mortars, the stutter of machine guns, and the crack of rifle fire all packaged together like the sound of a hurricane seemed an inherent part of life now. 3 times during the battle, we had to change our observation posts when they came under heavy enemy artillery fire. At 5 p.m. on June 12th, we moved our batteries back to the woods north of Senlis, while our infantry regrouped, and the French immediately attacked us there with aircraft and artillery. At 4 p.m. on June 13th, our infantry launched its second attack on Senlis. We took heavy enemy artillery fire on our own guns. Our observation posts took light machine gun fire from French Senegalese troops in trees, and French airplanes strafed our rear echelon positions. We moved our observation post back 100 metres into a large basement, and during the night the vacated observation post took a direct hit from the French artillery. We finally captured Senlis and resumed our march south toward Paris. It had been a fierce and bloody battle, with heavy losses on both sides, but it was our last big battle on the road to Paris. On June 14th, from 8 a.m. until 3 p.m, we marched 45 kilometres in one non-stop dash and went into position just short of the Marne River, in a beautiful park about 35 kilometres northeast of the centre of Paris. We could see the Eiffel Tower from the park. We had marched a total of 800 kilometres from Overath to Paris. We had a chance to relax for a few hours here and to wash up, which had become very important to us by now because hygiene had been taking a back seat to daily combat. At 9 p.m, however, we suddenly had an alert and were ordered to move into position just south of Tremblay, at the Orcou Canal, which lay between us and the Marne River. Paris had been declared an open city, meaning that the defenders would not resist in order to prevent further damage to the city the day before, but some French troops firing from the other side of the canal were sailors who had been drafted for the defence of Paris, and apparently had not received word that they were not to resist. A bridge over the canal had not been blown, and these French sailors were defending it with machine guns. It was a heavily wooded area, dotted with little villages. The canal was at the south end of one of these villages. A street ran through the village, flanked on each side by stores and houses. About 30 yards beyond a sharp bend in the street was the bridge. Our infantry had been pinned down at the bridge by the French machine guns firing from the other side of the canal, which was about 12 metres wide. After trying and failing to silence the machine guns with mortars, the infantry asked the artillery for help. We could not shoot from behind with an observer up front, as we normally did, because it was in a wooded area and the distance was too short. The only way was to bring a gun forward and fire directly into the machine gun positions, as we had at the Oise River. I was up front with the infantry, and when they asked for help, I called for a 105mm gun from the 1st Battery to come up. The infantry commander showed me a house across the canal, to the right side of the bridge, from which the French machine guns were firing. I went to the gun and gun crew to get things ready. We had to have the gun ready to fire, push it around the bend, behind which we were protected by a building, aim and fire at the machine guns about 25 metres away before they could get us with their fire. It was not my job to do this, but I wanted to do it to make sure it was effective. 7 of us manned the gun. The crew was headed by a Wachtmeister instead of the usual Gefreiter, apparently because the Wachtmeister also wanted to make certain that nothing went wrong. The crew loaded the gun, and I checked to make certain nothing had been overlooked and everything was ready. At my command, we will push the gun around the corner, and I will aim the gun and give the order to fire. Everyone understand? I looked around, and all the 6 men nodded. "Let's go," I ordered. "Yeah." We pushed the gun around the corner of the building at the bend. Pinpoints of light flashed from the machine guns in the basement across the canal as we aimed the gun and jerked the cord. The French had got their rounds off first, and by the time our gun fired, all 7 of us were sprawled on the ground. I knew I had been hit in the left wrist, but I peered across the canal to see if we had knocked out the enemy machine guns. Only smoke now came from the basement where the machine guns had been located, and our infantry was already dashing across the bridge. I ducked back to safety around the corner of the building to examine my wrist. A bullet had entered through the back of my hand and exited through my wrist. Blood was oozing out of the wound. It felt numb now. The pain would come later. I quickly inspected the rest of my body. Although no other bullets had touched my flesh, I found a hole through the side of my jacket, one through my sleeve and one through my map case. I silently counted my blessings that I had only been hit in the wrist. The machine gunner was obviously a good shot, especially for a sailor. Although 3 of the other men had also been hit, no one had been killed. The bridge was now open to us, and the next morning the division was in Paris. Infantry medics immediately tended to those of us who had been hit, bandaging our wounds as well as possible. They put some medication on my wound, and then wrapped gauze around my hand and wrist. The wound still felt numb. The pain had not yet started. The infantry brought up an ambulance and loaded us into the back of it, where we sat on benches. The Wachtmeister had been hit in the shoulder, and the cannoneers had been hit in the thigh and right side, respectively. Despite our wounds, we left with the knowledge that our efforts had cleared the way for the infantry. The ambulance took us to a field hospital a few kilometres behind the lines, where a doctor looked at our wounds. They put on better dressings, gave us tetanus shots, and gave us some medication to prevent infection. We were then loaded on a bus with other wounded soldiers and taken to a hospital at Noyen, where we were to catch an airplane to Bonn the next morning. The bus trip was not especially pleasant, since we were all beginning to recover from the shock of being wounded, and the pain was beginning. There was very little talk, just an occasional groan from someone. The jolting bus had no concern for painful injuries. Pain can rob the sweetness from the taste of victory. Arriving at the hospital at Noyen around midnight, we were quickly processed and assigned to beds. We were given pain medication to enable us to sleep, and I went to sleep thinking what a foolish thing I had done to take such a needless risk. It could easily have cost me my life. I wondered for a moment if I had subconsciously done it to prove my bravery. I shuddered involuntarily at the thought. I could have been killed so easily in that hail of bullets. But many men had been killed during this campaign, and I would have been just one more. I went to sleep very glad to be alive, even with pain. Medics woke us early the next morning, gave us breakfast, and loaded us back aboard the bus to be taken to the transport airplane that would fly us to Bonn. By now my wrist was throbbing painfully and my hand was beginning to swell. The airplane had no seats, but the crew gave us each a cushion to sit on. We made ourselves as comfortable as possible on the floor of the airplane for the flight to Bonn. We were all able to walk. Apparently the more seriously wounded were kept in hospitals in France. Conversations sprang up among the wounded men as the flight droned on, mostly about the action in which people were wounded. Laughter was sprinkled throughout the conversations now. I was beginning to learn how the human mind tries to cope with the horrors of combat. We landed at Bonn, where medics once again put us on a bus and took us to a hospital. A doctor inspected my wrist, put a fresh dressing on it, and told me he would have to wait until the swelling went down before putting a cast on it. I learned here that my division had held a parade in Paris, and I had missed it, just as I had missed the parade at Plauen after the Sudetenland operation. I called my parents to let them know I was on my way home and that I was not badly hurt. I stayed in Bonn nearly 3 weeks, just waiting for the swelling to come down. On June 19th, while at Bonn, I was awarded the Iron Cross Second Class and the Verwundetenabzeichen in black, wound badge equivalent to the American Purple Heart. It was black for the first time a soldier was wounded, silver for the 3rd time, and gold for the 5th time. Since I was not restricted to the hospital, I spent the days resting, going to restaurants and movies, and exploring the city. Bonn, the birthplace of Beethoven, was just a sleepy little town at the time. Finally, after almost 3 weeks, the swelling had almost left my hand, and the doctor put a cast on it. I asked to be transferred to a hospital in Leipzig, and the hospital administrator wrote me a train ticket to Leipzig. I checked into the hospital in Leipzig on July 9th, 1940. The doctor there removed my cast and inspected my hand. The machine gun bullet had smashed some small bones in my hand and severed the sensory nerve for several of my fingers. The artery and the motor nerve were undamaged, however, so I was lucky. The doctor put a new cast on my wrist. The wrist had to heal itself. All the doctors could do was try to prevent infection. I was not restricted to the hospital, and my parents' home was only 20 minutes from the hospital by streetcar. The familiar green and beige streetcars of Leipzig made me feel at home. I climbed the stairs to my parents' second-floor apartment, feeling that it was very good to be home again. The happiness in my mother's face when she saw me was almost worth getting wounded for. I was more aware of the apartment and little details of my family's appearance than ever before. I assumed this was a result of my close brush with death. I visited my father at his restaurant and nightclub that first day, rather than waiting for him to come home. He was as surprised and emotional as my mother had been, and we sat at a table and talked for 2 hours. Inge returned home in late afternoon from the hospital where she was a nurse. Even she seemed glad to see me and concerned about my wound. It felt very good to be back home with my family, except for Fritz, who was in the army at Jena. My father was extremely proud of all that Germany had achieved, and he was proud that I had been part of it. I looked forward to seeing Liebelt and Ebert while I was in Leipzig. I did not have to wait long, as they heard I was in town. I met them at a nightclub. They were there waiting for me. It was pure joy to be with old friends and to be entirely safe. It was as though we had never been apart. "How is Friedrich doing?" I finally asked. "You do not know?" Ebert asked, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Know what?" My eyes darted from Ebert to Liebelt. Then the significance of their silence slapped me in the face. They both took deep breaths at the same time. "I thought you knew," Liebelt said. The same desperate, unhappy feeling I'd had when Rehberg was killed washed over me again. So Friedrich had died of the wounds he had received in Poland. I remembered Rake's counsel when Rehberg was killed. Friedrich's life was another price we had to pay for our success. I learned where Friedrich was buried and visited his grave the next day. I stood in a drizzling rain, on wet, soggy ground by his grave, under an ugly, overcast sky, just feeling empty. Poor Friedrich. He had been so full of life, and so sure of all the good things life had in store for him. Our ski trip after graduating from gymnasium came rushing back. Could it really have been only 4 years ago? So much had happened since then, and I felt so much older. I decided it was best not to dwell on such things, but to try to concentrate instead on what had been accomplished in that time. I went home from the hospital every day, and I was even allowed to stay at home on the weekends. Most days I went to a movie or to one of the afternoon cafes that had dancing. Public dancing had been banned while the fighting was going on and while our soldiers were dying in France, but now it was permitted again. I did not dance because my arm was in a sling, but I enjoyed watching other couples. One afternoon in a cafe, I watched a naval officer at a table with 2 girls. The more attractive girl did not appear to be the one who was with him, although he danced with both of them. When the music was over there, I went to another cafe after getting something to eat. After a while, the naval officer and girls came there as well. Since these were the 2 nicest places in Leipzig, it was not a great coincidence. They recognized me when they came in, and I smiled at them. They sat down a few tables away from me, and I found it difficult to keep my eyes away from the prettier girl. She had beautiful brunette hair, a petite but shapely build, and a pretty face with high cheekbones. When the musicians played the last dance, I was determined to ask her to dance in spite of my sling. Her blue eyes sparkled as she smiled. "Of course," she said, rising. She did not even deign to glance at my sling. Dancing was just a little awkward with one arm in a sling, but we managed. We danced and talked, and she was friendly and witty. I was quite taken with her. I mentioned a piano concert that I planned to attend the following week and asked if she planned to go. She was coquettish and non-committal, but I felt I had reason to hope she would be there. At the piano concert the next week, I watched for her even though there were several hundred people there. I saw her come into the lobby and went up behind her and tapped her on the shoulder. "Hello there," I said when she turned around. "Well," she said, smiling impishly. "What a surprise!" We sat together during the concert. From then on, we were together practically every day until I returned to duty. Her name was Lieselotte, abbreviated Lilo, and she was a 19-year-old photographer who managed a portrait studio. Lilo and I spent our evenings going to dinner, to the theatre, to concerts and to dances. I would pick her up at the studio when she got off work, and we would spend the evening together. She was great fun to be with, light-hearted and gay, with a quick smile and a ready laugh. She loved life. We had about a month together before I returned to duty. The mood of all the people I met during my convalescence was very positive. The surrender of France was a great victory for Germany. We had a friendship treaty with Russia, so England was the only remaining hostile power, but we recognized that England could be a real problem for us. Although we had just thrown the British Army out of Europe, we knew we would not be able to invade England without heavy losses. At this time, everything was pretty normal in Germany except that a declared state of war existed between Germany and England. Of course, rationing was still in effect, but the people were relaxed, and it was a time of great national pride. The doctor at the hospital told me I could not return to duty until I could make a fist. As much as I was enjoying my convalescence in Leipzig, and especially Lilo's company, I was ready to return to military life. I started then to work my hand wherever I was, at the movies, in restaurants, everywhere. By September 1940, I could make a fist, and the doctor released me to return to duty. I had now been in the army 4 years. I left Leipzig the morning of September 5th, 1940. Lilo went with me to the train station to bid me goodbye. I hated leaving her. Meeting Lilo had been the highlight of my convalescent leave, and meeting her had helped offset the sadness of Friedrich's death. Thinking of Friedrich made me shudder, and I concentrated on thinking about Lilo instead. I had been away from my battalion approximately 3 months, from June until September. I went first to Plauen, which was my home base when I was in Germany. Every army unit in the field had a home base in Germany. Plauen looked exactly as I remembered it. I had been gone from there only a year. Why did it seem so much longer? So much had happened during that year, in the Eifel Mountains, at Leitzkau, at Overath, at Proyart, on the Somme River, at all the other towns and rivers where the French turned to fight on our march through France. I felt different and much older than I had when I last saw the assembly area by the barracks. I looked over the parade ground where we had staged so many parades and exercises. Manoeuvres and exercises had been so textbook logical then. We had staged mock battles, debated tactics and logistics, and then had dinner and relaxed. What a huge gulf existed between theory and reality, not physically, because combat was remarkably similar to manoeuvres, but in the realization of the price that had to be paid in human lives and suffering. I wished almost desperately that I could erase from my memory the image of Rehberg's face before we buried him, and the faces of my friends when I learned of Friedrich's death. I reported to the commanding officer of my old battalion at Plauen, a Major Brunt. "You are to report to your old battalion in France," he said. "Only this time you will be reporting as an Oberleutnant." He smiled. "Congratulations." "Thank you, Herr Major," I said, pleasantly surprised. I checked into my assigned room and went to the officers' mess for dinner. I knew no one there. After dinner, I went into Plauen. As I walked through the door of a café, I saw people at tables, drinking tea and laughing and chatting. I just stood and enjoyed the sight of them for a moment. It seemed like such a long time. Had it been only a year since I too had felt that carefree? Time seemed to have stopped in Plauen. The war seemed not to have happened. People here seemed blissfully unaware of the price that was being paid in France for our successes. They all seemed exactly the same, while I felt so much older and used, or sad, or something. Dürnberg, Rehberg, Friedrich. The cost of war was indeed high. I left the next day for France and arrived in Paris on September 7th, 1940. I stayed there a couple of days to enjoy the famous city. I went to the opera and I visited the Panthéon, Notre Dame, the Arc de Triomphe, the Champs-Élysées, and even climbed the Eiffel Tower. While I was in Paris, I revelled in the architecture of the beautiful city and its cultural wealth. I joined my old battalion at Montlhéry-Lignard, about 35 kilometres south of Paris. Ruck and Wimmer invited me to dinner my first night back. They filled me in on every detail of the grand victory parade that was staged down the Champs-Élysées after the capture of Paris. Altogether, during our drive from Cologne to Paris, we had marched approximately 800 kilometres. I had experienced every moment of our drive from Cologne to Paris except the victory celebration. Someone had taken my place as battalion adjutant during the victory parade while I was in the hospital at Bonn. I resolved that I would not miss the victory parade in London. Ruck and Wimmer had other news as well. Wimmer had been released to go home. Apparently, the army did not feel that England would be such a demanding chore that we would need the reserves. I was happy for Wimmer. He was a good battery commander and a conscientious soldier, but he was a civilian at heart. Then it occurred to me that 1st Battery would be getting a new battery commander. "When will the new battery commander arrive?" I asked Rake. "He just arrived," Rake said, smiling. "Not only have you been promoted in rank, but in responsibility as well. You are 1st Battery's new battery commander. Congratulations." I was elated. When I went to bed that night, my mind whirled with the news. So much had happened so quickly that I could hardly adapt to it all. Lieutenant Jaschke, who had replaced Rehberg at the Somme River, was still forward observation officer of my old battery. The battery officer was Lieutenant Steinbach, a giant of a man at 6'6" and 250 pounds. It was almost comical to see Steinbach and Jaschke together, because the difference in size between the two men was about a foot in height and 100 pounds in weight. After the fall of Paris, France had been divided into two sectors. The north was occupied by the German army, and the south was administered by the French Vichy government. When I arrived, our battalion was ready to move just north of the demarcation line south of the Loire River. We were moving into the Blois area, probably as security against something happening at the demarcation line. The battalion had fully recovered from the campaign through France and had been replenished with replacements for lost people, horses, and equipment. We were fully prepared for whatever was in store for us, which we assumed would be the invasion of England. Each unit within our division was assigned an area of administrative responsibility in the occupied zone. Within our battalion, our batteries were each assigned a different village, with battalion headquarters in a centrally located village. Condé-sur-Beuvron, a small, picturesque community of about 2,500 people, was assigned to my battery. It was located about 18 kilometres southwest of Blois, where the Beuvron River emptied into the Loire River. I had no idea what to expect from the people of Condé. As the battery marched into the village, we could see the villagers out in force awaiting our arrival. I halted the battery, dismounted from Schwabenprinz, and handed the reins to my Pferdehalter. An older man with a cane approached me. Short, a bit portly and grey, he wore a formal black suit. "Monsieur Leclerc, Mayor of Condé," he said in French. "Oberleutnant Knappe, assigned by the German army to administer your village," I responded in French. If Monsieur Leclerc had the same apprehensive feelings I did, he certainly did not show them. I told him I would need a place for my headquarters, stables for our horses, and housing for our troops. He was very accommodating and told me that he had been fully instructed to prepare for our arrival. He took me to a chateau near where the Beuvron and the Loire rivers met. It had been built long ago by a nobleman, and the present owner had fled the country when the fighting came near. It had stables and barns for our horses, troops, and equipment. It was an excellent site for our headquarters. I thanked him and invited him to have dinner with me that evening. He agreed and left us to settle in. The chateau had 15 fully furnished rooms. I used some of the rooms as headquarters offices and assigned some as quarters for Lieutenant Jaschke, Lieutenant Steinbach, and Hauptwachtmeister Schnabel. I chose a small cottage close to the Beuvron River as my quarters. It had a living room, a bedroom, a bathroom, and a kitchen. Lammers, as usual, fixed it up very nicely for me. I sent word to Mayor Leclerc, via Lammers, to meet me at 7 p.m. for dinner. Lammers returned with the message that we would be dining at Leclerc's home. Apparently, this was going to be a cooperative effort. We dined in his quaint house, with his wife serving us like a maid rather than joining us for dinner. It was a pleasant meal and a pleasant experience. I explained to Leclerc that he should continue in his job as before, that he would continue to handle civil matters. I instructed him to have all the villagers surrender their firearms to my headquarters the next morning. I also informed him that travel outside the village would be restricted, although I would issue travel permits on request for legitimate reasons. He agreed to everything, and the next morning the collected firearms were delivered to my headquarters, as instructed. The French people in Condé were living quite well, considerably better than the German population in big cities. We lived better in Condé than I had at home on convalescent leave. In Germany, everything was rationed: food, clothing, gasoline, etc. But in Condé, we could go to restaurants and get anything we wanted without ration cards. We could buy any food we wanted from local farmers. I was even able to go to a tailor and have riding breeches made and buy the best riding boots without a ration card, and they had the leather to make them. This was both because France was less densely populated than Germany, and because the French population was less regimented and controlled. For example, A German chicken farmer had to give a certain percentage of his eggs to the government. Nothing like this was being done in France. I quartered most of my battery on the chateau property, which was a very convenient arrangement. Jaschke, Steinbach and Schnabel had their offices in the chateau as well as their living quarters. We went back to our old pre-campaign schedule of training. Our philosophy was that soldiers had to be kept occupied. In addition, we had to be prepared for whatever might happen. We planned a full schedule for every day, from 5 a.m. until 8 p.m. Even though these were the same troops we had marched into France with, except for replacements, we kept them active and practicing. We wanted to keep their skills sharp and to train them in other functions so that if someone was wounded, we would have someone else who could do that job. The soldiers spent a lot of time keeping the equipment clean and in good working order. We had learned during our march across France that equipment can break down very easily on the march. We did not feel the war was over because England still had not been defeated. Although we expected to invade England, horse-drawn artillery could have no part in an amphibious operation. We would go over only after the beachheads had been firmly established. We did not take the expected invasion of England lightly. We knew the English Channel would be a very big problem for us, and we had a healthy respect for the fighting ability of the British Army because it had acquitted itself very well in the last war. We also knew England had a formidable navy and air force. We did not know that the Luftwaffe was losing the Battle of Britain because our controlled press did not report it. We learned only much later that the German press reported only victories. Occupation duty was a pleasant interlude. Candé and the area for which I was responsible were quite peaceful. We had no instances of resistance or sabotage, although we received reports of that sort of thing happening in other areas and were cautioned to be on guard against it. It may be because ours was a rural area. The mayor and I retained an amicable working relationship. He came to me only when he needed help. If a farmer wanted to go to Blois to sell his produce, for example, the mayor would come to me and ask for a travel permit for the farmer, and I would issue it. For the most part, I worked only through the mayor, although on rare occasions a villager would come to me with a problem. I went home at Christmas that year for the first time since I joined the army. I had always before gone home at New Year's. It was a 900-kilometre train ride from Blois to Leipzig. The trains and train stations were crowded with people going home for Christmas, a great many of them in uniform. Everyone seemed happy and in the spirit of the season. I spent Christmas Eve, the traditional time to exchange gifts in Germany, with my family. Fritz was also home from Jena, and we enjoyed rehashing our experiences there. He was enjoying the army in spite of its rigours and discipline. I joined Lilo and her family on Christmas Day. Lilo and I spent as much time together as possible, and I returned to Candé more taken with her than ever. Although the battalion's batteries were in various villages, we cooperated closely with one another. Once each month, Major Ruck hosted a dinner for all the officers under his command. Some of us also occasionally went pheasant hunting along the Loire River, using some of the shotguns we had confiscated from the local population. I got to know some of the officers in the other batteries well. On some weekends, 2 or 3 of us would go to Paris by train. We would get Rake's permission to go and have someone drive us to the railroad station in Blois. It was just over an hour to Paris by train, and the train was free to German soldiers. We would leave on Saturday morning and come back Sunday evening. Blois and Aldens were also interesting in their own right. They were historic places, with beautiful large medieval castles that had not been damaged by the fighting. The area boasted many good restaurants, and the famous French cavalry school of Saumur was but a short distance from Candé. In early March, I received a 16-day furlough. Lilo and I had been writing letters back and forth, sometimes in French just for the fun of it. We made arrangements now to meet in the Austrian Alps for a skiing holiday. We enjoyed being together for several days, we enjoyed the beautiful weather, and we enjoyed the skiing. We would sleep late, have a leisurely breakfast, and then hit the slopes. In the evening, we would have dinner in a nice restaurant and go to a movie. Then we would walk back to our hotel hand in hand, sometimes singing and laughing, and sometimes just enjoying the beautiful scenery bathed in moonlight. We felt that it was a wonderful time to be alive and together. Then we returned to Leipzig together, and I visited my family and Lilo's. I looked up Liebelt and Ebert while I was home. We agreed that events had proved old Herr Hoffer's prediction accurate, but that events had certainly not hurt Germany as Hoffer's prediction had seemed to imply. Shortly after I returned to Candé, our division was ordered to move not toward the English Channel, but to East Prussia. I could not help wondering if we were abandoning the plan to invade England. If so, it seemed strange to me, because England had declared war on us and that state of war still existed. Siegfried Knapper, and fellow officer in occupied France, 1941. For whatever reason, we had been ordered to East Prussia, away from the English Channel. As a battery commander, I was just concerned with my battery and my immediate responsibilities of making the move and getting established in East Prussia. The move was more than 1,200 kilometres, and more than 100 trains were required in order to move the whole division of 18,000 men, plus 2,500 horses and all of our artillery and equipment. France had been very pleasant, with its beautiful countryside, good food and friendly population, and we hated to leave. But East Prussia was also nice. It was an agricultural area, hilly, with sandy soil that was good for growing rye and potatoes. The area had a lot of lakes, beautiful beaches, and forests of white beech trees. It was a prosperous horse-breeding area, with rich farms and pleasant villages. We unloaded at Osterode and marched to Marwade, a village nearby, about 270 kilometres from the Russian border, the former Polish border. From time to time while we were there, we moved out to live in the field and practice the mechanical things, such as how to secure the horses, how to put together a tent, how to camouflage the guns, how to get the guns into position, and so on. It was practically a peacetime existence, with lots of practice and manoeuvres in the field. As an Oberleutnant and battery commander, I had 2 lieutenants and about 180 soldiers. We practiced constantly with our guns. During practice exercises, the men would take the horses to the river to water and wash them, and as often as not, to have a swim in the river. They would sing as they rode the horses to and from the river. It was a happy time for us all. We shared an Easter festival with the local population, with our regimental band playing for everyone. We staged soccer games and wrestling matches for everyone's entertainment. There was a dance hall in the village where dances were held on Saturday night, and our men dated the local girls. During the couple of months we were in Marwald, we were often invited into homes and had many conversations with the village population. They had not suffered so far because, like the people in France, they were farmers and they had enough to eat. They were not bothered by rationing because they had all the eggs and meat they wanted, even though there was some control. They had to get permission to slaughter a pig or a cow, but they did not report all the livestock they had. So food was never a problem here the way it was in the city, where you could not have a dinner party unless you got some extra ration cards. There was not much worry as far as the war was concerned either. So far, everything that we had been told about by the German press had been victorious. When we were less than victorious, such as in the air war over England, the German press did not report the battles. So it was a good time as far as we knew. In early June 1941, we received orders to move to Prostken, another East Prussian village that was only a few kilometres from the present Russian border. Prostken was not as large as Marwald, and living conditions were more field-like because not enough housing accommodations were available, and some of the soldiers had to live in tents. We had also left friends in the old village, and we were not very happy about this move. However, we accepted it, not only because we had to, but also because we knew that soldiers get complacent if they stay in one place too long. Any army unit loses its punch if the soldiers are too comfortable for too long. When we moved into the new village, we investigated the terrain for practice exercises as we would normally do when we moved into any new location, and we began our usual training routine. Then one day Major Raka summoned Schumann, Wittnauer and me, his battery commanders, to his office. He had a greatly enlarged map of the area posted on his office wall. "Gentlemen," Rake said, "study this map carefully. We must determine the best position for our guns in the event of an attack on Russia." We stared at him, speechless. We had a friendship treaty with Russia, and we were at war with England. Things were not adding up. "Why would we attack Russia?" I asked. "It is just an exercise," Rake said. "A hypothetical situation." We studied the map and, with Rake, determined the best positions for the guns of each battery. We then went out and found the positions assigned to us. It could have been just another exercise, but none of us really believed that. We did not have orders to move our guns into the positions, only to be familiar with our assigned locations and ready to move our guns into them. This had formerly been the border between East Prussia and Poland, but now that Germany and Russia had divided Poland between them, it was the border between East Prussia and Russia. The Russians had created a no-man's land on their side of the border by removing everything that was there in order to provide an unobstructed view. Then they had installed a barbed wire fence and sentry towers to keep watch. There were no changes on our side. Rye and potato fields, as well as patches of birch and fir trees, almost bordered the fence. Schumann, Wittnauer and I were then summoned to Rake's office again. Rake looked very serious and tense this time. "You are each to send a work detail of men in civilian clothing to load 300 rounds of ammunition for your guns into farm wagons and take the rounds to your assigned gun positions," he said. "Your men are to look like farmers doing farm work, and your ammunition is to be camouflaged after you unload it." We did not look at each other. It was evident that we were going to invade Russia, even though we had a friendship treaty with her. "When are we going to invade, Major?" Schumann asked. "It is only an exercise, Schumann, a purely hypothetical situation, but we have to make it look as real as possible." "Jawohl, Herr Major," Schumann said. Rake apparently was still not at liberty to tell us the truth, and was obviously very uncomfortable with the position he was in. I returned to my office and called Schnabel in. "Select a work detail of 12 men, Schnabel," I said. "Have the men borrow civilian work clothing from the local farmers who are stabling our horses. They must also borrow wagons from the farmers. The detail is to move 300 rounds of ammunition up to the gun positions for an exercise. They are to look to the Russian sentries like German farmers going about routine farm work. Of course, the rounds are to be camouflaged in the wagons and when they are unloaded." "Jawohl, Herr Oberleutnant," Schnabel said. We had been in Prostken about 3 weeks by now, and the horse handlers knew the farm families where their horses were being kept. Getting civilian clothing was no problem for them. They simply asked the farmers to lend them civilian clothing and farm wagons. This assignment was something of a holiday for them because it was different from normal army routine. The rather comical-looking crew loaded the ammunition into the farmers' wagons, and then, pretending they were farmers doing farm work, they hauled the ammunition to the designated positions, unloaded it, and covered it with brush. The next day, June 21st, 1941, battery commanders were finally officially informed of what was about to happen. "Before daylight tomorrow, we will invade the Soviet Union," Rake said simply. "I was forbidden to tell you until now." "Why are we invading Russia?" Wittnauer asked. Rake shrugged his shoulders. "We are soldiers," he said. "We do as we are told." It seemed inexplicable to me that we were getting ready to invade the Soviet Union. We were at war with England. We had a friendship treaty with the Soviet Union, and there had been no government propaganda against Russia. However, the propaganda started almost immediately, even in the official army order we received. The communist regime in Russia is imposing cruelties upon the Baltic and other ethnic minorities, as well as the Russian people. Therefore, we must destroy this cruel government and the communist commissars. The justification was simply that they were communists, and we had to fight them. The German government at that time used the word communist to excuse anything it wanted to do to Russia, just as the Soviet Union and the Western powers later used the words Nazi and fascist to justify anything they wanted to do to Germany. I did not know a lot about the Soviet Union at the time. I knew it was a backward country. I knew the communist government had persecuted landowners. I knew about the fighting between the Red and White armies during the Russian Revolution. I knew about the forced collectivization and the mass starvation of large segments of its population, and I knew about the purge of the officer corps in the Soviet army. I did not think the Red Army could be very effective, not only because of the purge of its officer corps, but because they had a political officer in every unit who could overrule the orders of any military commander, and I could not see how that could possibly be made to work. Ironically, something similar was initiated in the German army in 1944 after the assassination attempt against Hitler, except that the political officer could not overrule the military commander.